The shadow scheme was introduced by the government in the late 30s to duplicate or to increase production in preparation for the war effort. It could mean two things really. It could mean that existing companies were given the resources to build additional capacity either on site or on a different location in the country to produce, to shadow their product to increase production. But it could also mean that a product was given to a completely different company so that a separate company with the necessary experience and skills could build somebody else's product to duplicate production for both reasons, again for increased output, but also should one of the production lines be hit, that there was a separate production line in place with the skills and the experience to build products.
There was a growing concern in the mid-1930s that Britain was at peril, in a sense, from the threat from Germany, and particularly from German air power. As we know, the Nazis made great propaganda claims about the power of their air force, the Luftwaffe. Subsequently, we understand those claims were inflated, but nevertheless it caused grave concern in British political and military circles. And of all the potential threats that Britain faced in the 1930s, and remember Britain had an empire, so there was a threat in the Far East from Japan, a threat in the Mediterranean from Mussolini, endangering British Mediterranean interests. Now, those things would have required building of ships, first and foremost, but the biggest threat, the biggest danger was perceived to be from German air power. And so the clear need was to build up a British air force, and in particular, a strategic decision was taken in 1936 that there had to be in a sense, a deterrent, and that deterrent meant building British bomber aircraft. The hope was, of course, that if Britain built sufficient air power in this particular area, that would deter Germany from launching any attacks against Britain. So the clear strategic need was to build bomber aircraft, but Britain did not have basically the engineering capacity to be able to switch on the building of large numbers of bomber aircraft. And so the idea was to harness existing engineering capacity, and that meant for Britain that meant the car industry, and particularly the car industry in the West Midlands, and within that Coventry was the centre.
The government had decided quite early as 1927, that should there be another war, then the existing aircraft industry would have to be supplemented. And while the interwar period kept a design and technology base going, it was on very small batch orders over a variety of types. So as things developed in other areas of industry, particularly the automotive industry, the government started to formulate the idea that maybe the productive capacity of the automotive industry could be harnessed to the technology from the aircraft industry. And one of the drivers for that was the idea that both aircraft and cars were moving towards metal fabrication. And while that was the initial spark for the idea, in fact, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding, because aircraft tolerances were far tighter than automobile tolerances. So the initial factories were set up with the assistance of the existing motor industry, and Coventry was involved because of the enthusiasm for Roots in particular to be involved in this. Other manufacturers in the automotive sector were more sceptical. The aircraft manufacturers themselves were again rather concerned about the dilution or the entry of other firms into their arena. But the first set of factories established, particularly around Coventry, to make the Bristol engine were actually demonstrated to be very successful, and that led to further thinking of a second phase, and subsequently other firms that were initially sceptical became involved in production as the war progressed.
It's sometimes very difficult to find out who precisely built what, because a lot of the production was dispersed again, or some of the suppliers, and even internally within Coventry, for example, the Standard Motor Company built mosquitoes, but some of those components they built over 1,000 mosquitoes in Coventry, but some of the parts they were built at the Canley site in their factory here in Coventry, but they were assembled on the outskirts at Anstey in Coventry, which is a factory that's still standing, currently being operated by Rolls-Royce, and that's where the plane flew off. Obviously, the Rolls-Royce engines were supplied by Rolls-Royce, but some of the components of that mosquito would no doubt have been built by other companies here in Coventry, or even their suppliers that they traditionally used before the war, because a lot of the production process was broken up and different people fed their parts into the production system and then final assembly at Anstey.
The key factors essentially are to persuade the motor manufacturers that they will play a role essentially as a manager. So the government would finance the building of the factories, and if you are going to build a factory, therefore where do you build the factory? The motor car manufacturers had land, most of them had land adjacent to their existing plants, but therefore you have to negotiate an appropriate sale of the land at the right price. So there was a lot of negotiation involved in that. That sets up what is known as the number one scheme that gets underway in 1937. It quickly becomes apparent that the capacity of this so-called number one scheme is going to be insufficient. So then the number two scheme comes along, and there the motor manufacturers suggest that new, in a sense, greenfield sites should be made available. There is then a lot of discussion about precisely where these greenfield sites should be. Here you have a critical balance to strike. The whole basis of the Shadow Factory scheme, why it comes to Coventry, is that you have, in a sense, a concentration of entrepreneurial talent, organisational skills, engineering skills, management skills, within a fairly narrow geographical area.
Well, the enthusiasm of roots in Coventry obviously helped a great deal, but the Midlands was very much the centre, if you include Oxford, of the automotive industry at that period. It was also the centre of the growth of light engineering between the two world wars, and it was where the skills resided that were necessary to the expansion of aircraft production. You know, the aircraft industry itself was very scattered about the country, and some companies like Gloucester Aircraft stayed in business by manufacturing milk churns on the side and all sorts of other activities, whereas within the West Midlands you had a very solid concentration of state-of-the-art companies within their sector, and that was very attractive.
The key thing was to enlist the interest and the support of the motor manufacturers themselves. Not only the motor manufacturers, but the key aircraft manufacturer. The aircraft in particular that Britain decided to support was the Blenheim. This was, as we now know, not a particularly effective aircraft, but it was the best that Britain had in the circumstances in the mid-1930s. And the Blenheim was being constructed by the Bristol Aircraft Company, and therefore how the scheme would inevitably have to operate was you would have to transfer the technology from the Bristol company, the aircraft company, to the motor manufacturers. So the first thing, of course, was to enlist the support and interest and the backing of these motor manufacturers. As far as Coventry was concerned, the key one really was Roots, but also Rover was a significant one. Further afield, we know, of course, Austin was going to be important, but essentially the concentration was in the West Midlands.
Well, in the late 30s, when it was becoming clear that there was a war coming, the car industry, of course, continued to build vehicles, which is obviously the natural product. So a lot of the pre-war products were adjusted to wartime production. A lot of the vehicles were turned to military vehicles. This could sometimes mean just regular cars being painted green and used as saloon cars, but also more specifically some of the commercial vehicles were used as military vehicles, lorries, etc. But also very specific military products like armed cars were built, or more fighting vehicles were built by the car industry. But sometimes the car companies were asked to do more specific research and development work on a product. For example, the Vauxhall and Luton were asked to lead a group of 11 companies to develop and build the Churchill tank. So they actually had an actual design input in the tank and the production of the tank, apart from building it as well. The Rover Car Company here in Coventry were asked by the government to make the Whittle jet engine producible. So they were given the contract to really to make design improvements. Well, they weren't asked to do design improvements, but they did, to make it production ready. And that's what they worked on for about a year before it was transferred later on to Rolls-Royce.
Having identified aircraft as the key need in rearmament terms, the hope is, of course, that these will never be used, but nevertheless, for the mid-1930s, it is the bomber aircraft, and then in the late 1930s, it is the fighter aircraft, because in the late 1930s, technology moves on. There is the development of the radar system, and if you have a radar system, you can hope to actually intercept enemy bomber aircraft. You would then intercept those with a fighter aircraft, a fast monoplane aircraft. We know that, of course, the classic example is the Spitfire for this. But having identified the aircraft as your key strategic need, the government has experience of the poor performance of the aircraft industry itself. So the Air Ministry does not have a high level of confidence that the aviation industry can actually perform, can actually produce the goods. There is of course technical skills, innovation there, creativity, design skills, but in terms of gearing up for mass production, it is not the aviation industry that you would look to. Hence the need to have, in a sense, a shadow scheme and bring in the car manufacturers.
From there to there is really the old building. This was obviously the old offices on the sides for the managers and whatever, and you can see it's a typical sort of late 30s office style sort of office blocks. There's the hangar. And towards the end of it, they used to take the aircraft out, the Hurricanes. They built ferry battles and Hawker Hurricanes here. And they were then assembled inside this building, pushed towards the end of the building, and there was a lift that took them up to the next level, the platform behind the hangar, and that's where the airfield was, which is now quite funny because it's now full of buildings, but that used to be the test track for Austin. And in the centre of the test track they had different runways. The smaller planes like the Ferry Battle and the Hawker Hurricane were flown offside. And the larger planes, which were built in sections at the eastward, just behind us, were then driven via the road to Elmdon, Birmingham Airport. At the far side of the airfield there was another shadow factory for Austin, where all these big aircraft, the Avro, Lancaster and the Short Stirling, were assembled, and they were flown out of Birmingham to whatever their destination was. This particular building was built in 1937, and it was really built together with the East Works. They were both the extension for wartime production at Longbridge for aircraft production. And in addition to these, to the flight jet and the East Works, they had an additional hangar over at Elmdon, Birmingham Airport for final assembly of the larger planes, which couldn't be flown out of this small airfield, and they were flown out of Birmingham Airport. But they were transported by road in large sections from here to the airport. A lot of the factories, the shadow factories, were huge, big modern factories, which up to that point, to the late 30s, wasn't really the norm, because the 20s and 30s wasn't necessarily a boom period in aircraft manufacturing. So a lot of the companies used in the 20s and 30s were quite small, relatively speaking, small factories. It wasn't until the late 30s that these big factories came about, which really gave them the capacity to build large volume of big aircraft. So it's an interesting story, and a lot of these factories post-war were either sold off or passed on to the people that operated them during the war, and that gave them a modern manufacturing capacity, often for, in this case, cars.
The second group, the so-called number 2 group that is built then in conjunction with the Coventry-based manufacturers, here the decision is taken to locate outside of the city centre. So the classic example, if you like, is the Ryton plant built by Roots, about 2 to 3 miles outside of the city centre, to the south of Coventry, outside of the city limits. This then, of course, raises questions about the local infrastructure. You can't simply create a big new factory without therefore laying in road systems, water systems, electricity systems, sanitation. All of this is involved. You then, in a sense, create an entirely new set of problems. And what about the workers? Where are the workers going to live? There are schemes initially, when the number 2 group is launched in 37 to 38, to build a whole new set of houses outside of Coventry to house the migrant workers, the vastly expanded worker population that is envisaged to build these, to construct and to work in these factories. It's quickly realised that there aren't actually the resources to do this. And so what happens is you get hostels being established to house this massive influx of workers.
Daimler built a lot of armed cars here in Coventry, again with other groups as well involved. Vauxhall built a tank. Ford built Merlin engines in Trafford Park in Manchester. They built Universal Carriers in Dagenham, and some of their other pre-war suppliers and other companies around the country built a lot of the Universal Carriers. Longbridge built a lot of the K-series lorries that were used for ambulances, for lorries. The famous Bedford lorry, the Bedford QL, you almost see in every film. Or every wartime archive material is a Bedford QL, because it was the bog standard army lorry. The RAF, the Hurricane, the Spitfire, the Sterling, the Lancaster, the Halifax, all of those were built by the car industry. They weren't exclusively built by the car industry, that was also built by the parent company, but they were all built by the car industry. If you think of the famous military vehicles, apart from the staff cars, which are the obvious one, if you think of the Universal Carrier that you always see racing around in North Africa in archive footage, the Morris commercials, the Bedfords, the AECs, they were all built by the car industry as well. The Daimler Dingo armed car, the Daimler armed car. There is a lot of aircraft, vehicles, but also weapons. The Stung gun was a lot of the car companies built components for the Stung gun. Thousands of jerry cans were built by the car industry. Helmets, the steel helmets were built by the car industry. Sometimes random things, shells were built by the car industry. So there was a wide variety of products, and sometimes it is interesting to see who built what.
Then things happened at the factory. They camouflaged it so that if I'd been a sparrow, I wouldn't have recognised it. Every inch of glass was removed from the roof and replaced with steel. Even the cars in the park were covered up so that the glint wouldn't be seen from the air. Then they organised ARP. We formed our own firefighting squads, one of the finest fire-watching systems in the country, and we stored materials for repairing bomb damage. We prepared against gas and had properly trained decontamination squads. In addition, some of us became home guards, guarding the factory day and night. I tell you, you'd think our factory was important. And it is. For inside the factory, we've switched over from peacetime to wartime just as quickly. Although we've been one of the first firms to turn over to the 5-day week, we've given it up for the time being, and willingly, because most of us feel that there's ruddy important work to be done by every man jack of us. The engines we'd fitted into those peacetime cars could run a war. Anyway, they now go into the chassis of army trucks and all sorts of mobile equipment. The axles and other parts that did a good job of work before the war have been found a dozen new uses. No shiny car bodies now, but plenty of practical camouflaged ones. We don't fit the same instruments as we did in peacetime, nor are the gadgets the same. But the boys fit the wartime accessories just as quickly.
Well, at the beginning of the war, they were coach builders, building a lot of products from wood. So that's how they started, making lorry bodies, again out of timber. But when the Lend-Lease agreement came out, things changed quite dramatically. We were having a lot of stuff shipped over from America, and a lot of it was getting lost in the convoys, so they decided it was better that we made as many spares and components and complete aircraft to some extent over here. So they shipped, the Americans shipped a lot of machine tools over here, and car bodies benefited greatly from that. Huge planers and presses, and from that they were able to press aircraft components, aircraft fuselage parts. And the thing that they were given that helped them most was a material called Kirksite, which is a soft alloy. And from that they could make very economical press tools. Steel press tools are expensive to make, but with Kirksite they could make them cheaper and turn out a great many components. They made an awful lot of bits and pieces. You probably heard the old Gracie Fields song, I make the thingamybobs that helped us win the war. That's what car bodies did amongst many other things. You know, the turrets that the bomber aircraft had, they got a subcontract from the people who were contracted to make that. They made the frameworks for those. The big Humber staff cars, they took the pressed steel wings from that, cut them in half, welded a bit in the middle. Trailer pumps. In London, the auxiliary fire service used a lot of taxi cabs and big American cars and light trucks to tow trailer pumps to combat huge fires. And car bodies made a lot of the bits and pieces for that. One of the things that the company made that employees were very proud to speak about after the war, obviously they couldn't speak about what they were making during the war, and that was a trailer caravan for Field Marshal Montgomery. He got the idea when he was in North Africa, and he captured a couple of caravans mounted on lorries from the Italians. And after D-Day, he had commissioned a trailer caravan, which he used as a mobile command centre. The chassis of the trailer was built by British Trailer Company, but car bodies built the whole body, kitted it out, fitted it out, and the whole lot. And again, that is one thing that the company was really proud about.
The Germans had a remarkable set of aerial photographs of almost every industrial area in England and Scotland and Wales, with every building, for example, in Parkhead Forge correctly labelled. So obviously they were targets as much as any other area.
Several factories were bombed, several here in Coventry were bombed. We have a lot of images and photographs, but it turns out, it often proves that a lot of these factories were easily repaired, and a lot of the machine tools were actually difficult to destroy. There were teams sent around the country who were actually specifically repaired machine tools because they were relatively easy to put back into production. You could really knock out the electric power supply, but a solid lathe, for example, is difficult to destroy. So often the factories were quickly repaired, or the shadow transferred to a slightly different part of the factory, and you often see that after a few weeks these factories, even if they had quite badly hit, were back into production.
When the first desultory bombing started, we were, I say we and half a dozen more young but largely young apprentices and operators were formed into sort of fire brigade squads to try and get bombed machinery working again. That was the number one job, to get these machines going again. Not always in Coventry. I mean, I was shot out with a few others. We had a little organisation called, I don't even know what the initials stand for now, MTech. It was a government group, you know, of fire brigade machine tool engineers that went everywhere. One week I'd be in Belfast, the next week I'd be in Filton, Bristol. Probably the next month or something like that, at Parkside, Coventry, you know, and so on. You see, keeping aircraft production machinery going.
As we know, of course, in the case of Coventry, the fatal raid is very, very successful at disrupting production. And of course creating a lot of damage and destruction and the lives lost. But in the longer term, what is found out is that it is very difficult to destroy a machine tool. And indeed, in spite of the massive bombing effort that the British and the American Air Forces then engage in with Nazi Germany, 1940, 42, 43, and of course culminating in the heavy raids of 44 and 45, what we find is that you can blow roofs off buildings, you can disrupt the working patterns of the workers, you can deprive them of sleep, and indeed, of course, you can destroy their houses and kill the workers as well. But it's very difficult to actually destroy and harm the productive facilities. Nevertheless, in the case of Coventry, such is the scare of the raid, of the Blitz on Coventry, that the Air Ministry decides that it does indeed have to disperse production, and so that decision that in a sense has always been hovering in the wings from the mid to late 1930s onwards, whether it is wise to site production, concentrate production in Coventry, that decision, of course, is actually taken to disperse production.
With the HW ward in Birmingham, we turned out thousands of capstan lathes, which were the backbone of the ammunition and small arms business, really.
My father, he'd been at the Standard since before the First World War. And he'd been down to de Havilland for a few months, and he came back, you know, and I was telling, and through his influence, he got me into the Standard. I mean, he was just starting up making the wing of the Mosquito. Well, I'd always been good at woodwork. I know my best subject at the art school really was wood carving. And so I started there, and of course there was all the production of the Airspeed Oxford going on, but there was my dad and two other fellas sorting the drawings out and what have you for the start the Mozzie.
First thing I drew was a £500 bombshell. I was given the lines and said get that onto press steel paper with some dimensions and let them have a look at it, because we had a cartridge case factory at Press Steel then, building, they were pressing out 25-pounder shell cases, and they were having a look to see whether they could do a bomb casing, but it was decided not, because we hadn't got the capability of doing it in steel, whereas most of the work was in brass in the cartridge case normal stuff.
When I started my apprenticeship at the Daimler, you go through the factory, you go into the stores, you work a storeman's job for a little while, then into the production shops. I went into the several production shops, went on automatic machines, automatic lathes for instance, and little fitting jobs and that sort of thing, ordinary lathes apart from automatic ones, getting a general feel, I suppose, for the factory as a whole. I was indentured as a toolroom apprentice, you see, but they all went through the machine shops then, prior to going to the toolroom.
Well, at the Standard we were making engines, aero engines. I'm talking now about the Shadow Factory at Fletchingstead Highway, and we were making aero engines. We were making engines for the Whitley, the Pegasus, and engines for the Blenheims, Mercury, the smaller cylinders, and we were making the engine parts or the completed engines going from Fletchingstead. That was our job, aero engines.
The Humber Scout car was a very noisy shop, metal cutting, steel being cut by flame cutters, and I think there were some other pressings done for the Elvis Scout car as well, the lightweight Scout car. They were a load of things. Later on, I had to draw some big plates up for a product called Pheasant, which was the 17-pounder gun for the Desert War. And we had to do those very quickly.
As the production of the Oxford ran down, anybody suitable was transferred onto the Mosquito. And at the same time, they started making the jigs for the fuselage of the Mosquito. And in the same workshop, divided just a little way there, and you know, things progressed. When they'd finished the fuselage jigs, they made 4, and they were in 2 hours, and it looked like a boat builder's shop going down, you know, with all the planking. But when they'd finished those, they didn't do the production. They were sent away to different workshops. So fellas who had been working on that, they came onto the wing as well.
But I eventually evolved into, later on, and especially when I came back out of the army later on, making gauges for the people in the tool room, making the gauges for milling cutters, backing off, what they call backing off, all sorts of, as well as general gauges for the machine shops in the factory.
Well, we had two big shops. We had one shop with the engine shop, where we did all the parts for the various radial engines that we were sending out to the Air Force. And then the other big factory up there at Fletchingstead was carburettors. the Claudel Hobson, that was the American carburettor, and we were making those carburettors. So one side was carburettors and the other side was cylinders, or complete engines, aero engines.
Our building, I think it was, the Lancaster main planes were being made. So all the pressings came from various parts in the factory and then were assembled up so that the main plane was stood up on its end and welded and riveted together, ready to ship up to Avro. And one of the jobs I did get on that was on the leading edge of the main plane. We had to insert, because it was a change, a piece of pressing with carrying a metalwork device, which was in fact a bolt cutter. And this was the bolt cutter for when, if the plane flew into a barrage balloon cable, it slid along the wing, slid in, fired the bolt and chopped off the cable. So we had to fit those in a modification.
We were working 12 hours a day, 12 hours a shift. So 24 hours the factory was working. They had a shop steward system where if you had a complaint you could go to the shop steward and he would look after you. And generally the whole attitude was that we were doing a worthwhile job and they were going to look after us, which they did.
They made scout cars, armoured, little small, mobile, nifty scout cars, not great big things. They were used, I can remember using in the desert campaign and in Europe later on.
They'd made a massive assembly jig out of girders and that for the wing, and then they'd laid some rail lines, and there were trolleys. As the wing came out the jig, it's putting these trolleys, and as it went up, the leading edge and the trailing edge, and loads of things were being done, and eventually it led to the dope shop where it, it was all the covering over it. And my job when they came out was fitting wingtips, and between the ailerons and the flaps there was like an inspection cover, and that had to be routed out a certain shape. I did that, and then an aluminium cover put on it.
And right up the top of the factory, fairly close to the cartridge case factory, was another very secure device. You needed a special purple pass to get in there. We were building midget submarines, and so that down in the shop, during my apprenticeship, I did all the various jobs, measuring and getting the bits made. We had to do the pressings and roller shape some of the things for the midget submarine.
Although we worked hard, nobody really objected to going, because we knew that what we were doing was towards the completion of the war and the final victory that we were all aiming for. That was a common thing, to aim for the final victory.
One of the features, and one of the interesting features of the scheme, was the mobilisation of women workers. In Germany, that was something that was ideologically not on their Nazi Party agenda. So of course they made extensive use of drafted workers, particularly from occupied territories, and many of whom were effectively slave labour. And of course that inevitably impacted on both volume of production and quality of production, even setting aside any deliberate sabotage that took place. So they were very much hampered by their approach.
Temporarily, there's a worthwhile job for women folk at the same basic rate of pay as men. 1,000 women and over 1,000 youths between 14 and 18 are carrying on the good work until the men come back. have picked up the work as quick as you like, and they lend a bit of colour and charm to the place. Yes, they're doing a grand job of work, and the management and the men are full of admiration for them. But we don't let them overdo it. They don't work more than 47 hours a week, and they don't work awkward shifts. We can do all that.
By early 1941, the government realised that it was going to have to extend conscription to women. It had been very reluctant to do so because in the 30s and so on, the place of women was seen to be in the home. So it really didn't want women to work. But in a population as small as Great Britain's, just under 48 million during the Second World War, they realised that all manpower and woman power would be required for the war effort, because we were, after all, fighting for our very existence. So Ernest Bevin, the Minister for Labour and National Service, required all women between the ages of 18 and 50 to go to the labour exchanges and be put into various kinds of war work. Some of them had already volunteered for the armed forces, for instance, and in factories, munitions factories, and so on and so forth. But after March 1941, if you were a woman between the ages of 18 and 50, you just didn't have a choice. You had to do war work. By the 1937 Factories Act, the working week was supposed to be 48 hours, but in wartime that often extended to 55 hours a week, which meant that women were doing 10-hour days plus 5 days a week, plus half day on Saturday. Factories were working round the clock, so you didn't all knock off at 5 or 6 o'clock or something. It was shift work, and so one shift finished, another arrived, and they were going 24 hours a day, including Sundays, bank holidays. Works weeks were abolished during wartime, but workers got 1 week off, which they were encouraged to take at home so as not to take up valuable places on the trains, which were essentially for troop movements.
First of all, I went to a class to learn theory. Girls who'd been used to cutting out dress patterns before were being taught to read engineers' blueprints. After that, I learned how to use a saw for cutting metal, called a hacksaw. At first, I broke a lot of blades and got a bit discouraged, but my instructor was very patient, and I soon passed on to the aero detail fitter shop. Mary and I have just been moved to another part of the factory, handling sections of the airframe, where the work's more skilled. But it's really all-important work, and there's a job to suit every woman, whether you're punching out parts, helping to assemble the framework, drilling sections of it, taking the stage further in assembly, or fitting the skin fabrics. You're all building a plane and helping to put one more in the sheds ready for the boys.
I worked at the GEC till the war broke out, because it was 37 when I came to Coventry, and I worked about 2 years in the ordinary factories before the war began, and then of course we all had to do war work, so I went to the Daimler. I got a job at the Daimler, and I worked there ever since till the war finished. I was doing engraving parts for aircraft. That's what they did at the Daimler, and there was machines, but I was an engraver. Parts for the planes had to be numbered, you see, and we had to engrave the numbers on.
They were so immediately taken in out of necessity, but there's no argument about it. And we had women doing strange and quite difficult jobs sometimes. Not only in Coventry engineering, but as I say, you know, I mean, girls that had, well, never seen beyond the counter of a shop or anything like that. We're putting Spitfires and Mosquitoes together. 80-20 probably proportion, women to men, in the depths of the war. Amazing.
Everybody had a job to do. It was a war, and that was it, you know. And and there was the servicemen brought in, deferred from their services for so long, you know, to work in the factories as well. There was airmen come and they did a job there, and until they were called back again. We were doing men's work as well, you see, because there was press work and there was different machines, you know, as women worked on, as well as men. We had the entertainment and lunchtime, and at that from ENSA, and we had the Squadronaires band for dancing during our lunch hour or our break, you know. It was quite good, really, considering there was a war on, you know. Everybody were the same, really. They just, well, what can I say? It was all right, you know. And then, of course, we had to put our heads down, like, and keep going.
I think women were very enthusiastic about working because this gave them a taste of independence. It gave them their own money. A lot of them, 2.5 million women, were alone because their husbands had gone off to war in the armed forces and so on. So work alleviated the loneliness and there was great camaraderie.
And of course we used to get the sirens every night when we were on nights, and we had to go to the shelters. There were shelters and we were down there, and that was how it was. It was frightening, really, you know. And then when the sirens, where it was all clear, we used to go back to the job again, and we were having sirens 2 or 3 times, you know. Once they cleared, then they'd come again, you know. We were in the shelters again.
But women were recruited quite widely into manufacturing and armaments at the beginning of the war, and of course that followed on from the extensive use of women in the production of munitions in the First War. But as early as 1943, which was the peak year of war production, there was talk of what they termed adjustment, which was of course the gradual removal of women from the workforce in order to make space for the men being demobilised from the armed services. And that process was really pretty much wrapped up by the end of hostilities.
I think that the Shadow scheme undoubtedly was a success in terms of the weapon, if you like, that was produced. And in the case of the West Midlands, overwhelmingly to begin with, that was the Blenheim bomber. I say it was a success in a sense because a lot of the skill, the organisational skills required, and the mobilisation, if you like, in terms of the broader picture, set up a number of lessons that could then be employed with the manufacture of other armaments, and the classic case here, of course, is the Spitfire. So it was successful in showing what could be done: the harnessing of private industry, the building of vast new manufacturing capacity. Always, when you engage in mass production, it is a critical question of what particular weapon you produce. The decision was taken to produce the Blenheim in the mid-1930s. By the late 1930s, that was obsolete. It was obsolete. It is Britain's great fortune that another weapon, the Spitfire, went into mass production just at the time that it was needed. Just in time. Britain produced just enough of these weapons.
I think the Shadow scheme has to be counted as a success, because by the end of the war, the Shadow plants had actually produced 45% of the heavy bombers for the RAF, as well as a significant proportion of the aero engines. It was a success because it did work. I think the understanding of the ability to create from a greenfield site a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility certainly influenced post-war industry policy, and you might argue down the track even influenced inward investors wanting to come and set up in the UK.
The managing director, Ernest Jones, actually received a letter from the government saying that he was one of the few, his car bodies was one of the few companies that weren't seen to be profiteering. And the government did tax the motor industry quite heavily, but in fact they gave him money back because they said he was one of the most honest people they dealt with. And that really set the company up for post-war production. It enabled them to do what they did in the 1950s and 1960s. They helped manufacture with the taxi and with the Ford Zephyr convertibles and many other things that they got involved in.
Well, immediately after the war, there was this big reaction. Women had to go back into the home. There were even magazine articles and newspaper articles saying women must stop wearing trousers, they must get back into dresses and so on. So there was that initial reaction, and that went on throughout the 1950s, really, when you saw advertisements which had the man going off to work with his briefcase or whatever, and the woman at home with her apron on, cooking and looking after the children. And all that, I think, really came to an end with the 1960s and better education for women, which had been one of the legacies of the 1944 Education Act. So I think there was a sort of memory among women of what it had been like to be independent, and they passed that on to their daughters, the next generation, who of course did become independent, who had careers, and for whom it seemed perfectly normal to do those things.
The factory, it was the Daimler again. We were doing cars, you know, limousines and Daimler cars. And I used to be in the trim shop doing the upholstery.
You carried on your career, if you'd like to call it that. And I was never out of it until I was 70 years old, with variations in different parts of the world, you know, but always with a company making machine tools or producing machine tools or marketing machine tools or whatever, but it carried me right through.
One of the best bits of luck I had in my life, my father got a lot of influence. Before the war finished, they started the experimental. They could see how the war was going, you know, and they were going to open up, and so that there wasn't much of a delay afterwards for car production. And they asked my father to go and run that, but he'd had enough of, you know, the responsibility. But he went back in there on the bench, see. And I say he got a lot of influence, and he got me with, I mean, I was good using my hands, and but I had no experience of any experimental body making, but he got me in there, you know, and I mean, I was really lucky there.
Well, in 1943 I volunteered for the army, and I was in the army for 4 years. When I was demobbed, I went back to the Daimler in the tool room, and one of the apprentices when I was there, Jackie Rowe, he started a jig and tool drawing office, contracted out to get work from other people. He was always on to me to go and work for him. And I said, well, I've not been on the drawing, but it doesn't matter. He says, you know how to make things, how to design them. So I went to him.
I went in the Air Force. I joined the ATC, the Air Training Corps, which we had at the Stellar Motor Company. And every Sunday morning we were on parade with the ATC, and we were doing basic training like navigation, Morse and things like this, in preparation to us going into the Air Force.
I worked on Rover and Jaguar, and I even did the panels on the Rolls-Royce Silver Dawn, things like that. But again, they were just complete body shell. So I decided to move, and I saw an advert in the paper and went to Aston Martin into motor racing, special cars. Worked on the DB24, the DB3, and the first lines on the DB4, which became the DB5. And David Brown was moving the factory up to Newport Pagnell, I think it was, which is a bit far north for me. And I thought there was an advert for somebody at MG, so I came to MG. And I stayed working on the MGA, stayed with MG right the way through design of the MGA coupe. I did the Le Mans MGA body and did some work on the record breakers, body shells. I did a new version of the EX213, which was the record breaker based on the Goldie Gardner car, and then came the idea of a new coupe on the MGA, but that was going to be too big a car, so we changed route completely and said new motor car, and I was given the okay to do a new body shape for a new car, and that's where the MGB evolved.
I think the legacy of the success of the scheme sits in more than one area. I think for the aircraft industry, they actually inherited the second generation plants, and you'll see that Rolls-Royce Hillington, Broughton in Lancashire, which is still a major centre for BAE systems, came out of this process. And they learned an awful lot. And I think, for example, Rolls-Royce, who were initially very sceptical of the idea of mass production of their products, went from their sort of 48% subcontracting arrangement in Derby to a 98% in-house production at Hillingdon, and that showed them they were capable of manufacturing on that scale to the standards they wanted to achieve. And I think that's underpinned their success right up to the present day, that they could clearly differentiate between the research and development that always remained at Derby and the ability to manufacture in volume. For the government learning from it, I think they got the idea that it is possible to create skills in a location that didn't have them previously, to transfer skills. And in the post-war period, with the New Town movement, with the dispersal of industry not for defensive reasons but for reasons of regional development, this underpinned the thinking for the new towns, for the relocation of industry, for the development of new industries in areas that hadn't had that type of industry before, which very much carried on right to the end of the 1970s.
Most other factories, as some of the industry left the UK or left, for example, Coventry, these factories were, in the last 10 years, a lot of them were demolished. The Banner Lane factory, which used to be the Massey Ferguson factory, was a shadow factory for the Standard Motor Company. That factory was demolished in the last 10 years. The Roots number 2 shadow factory on the outskirts of Coventry at Ryton was a Peugeot factory after the war, or it was part of the Roots Group Chrysler UK, and eventually became ownership of Peugeot. And they closed their factory in the last 10 years as well, and it was demolished about 5 years ago. Browns Lane, which was the big shadow factory for the Daimler company in Coventry again, was used up till about 5 years ago. And it became later part of the Daimler Jaguar production, and it was the home of the Jaguar really for many years. Some of the other factories in Birmingham, Longbridge, of course, famous for the Austin at Longbridge. They, in 2005, when production stopped, some of the wartime factories specifically built as shadow factories in the late 30s to support the war effort, specifically aircraft in this case, were still in use until 10 years ago. And so they're all mostly gone now. So there are some other shadow factories left in the aviation industry. For example, one of the big aircraft factory building Airbus wings in North Wales, Broughton, was a shadow factory built for Vickers Armstrong during the war. So it's quite interesting to see that a lot of these shadow factories, because they were large industrial complexes, that they lasted so long and really supported the post-war industry. And it's quite amazing to think now that some of these 70-year-old factories are still being used today. fed their parts into the production system, and then final assembly at Anstey.
The key factors essentially are to persuade the motor manufacturers that they will play a role essentially as a manager. So the government would finance the building of the factories, and if you're going to build a factory, therefore where do you build the factory? The motor car manufacturers had land, most of them had land adjacent to their existing plants, but therefore you have to negotiate an appropriate sale of the land at the right price. So there was a lot of negotiation involved in that. That sets up what is known as the number one scheme that gets underway in 1937. It quickly becomes apparent that the capacity of this so-called number one scheme is going to be insufficient. So then a number two scheme comes along, and there the motor manufacturers suggest that new, in a sense, greenfield sites should be made available. There is then a lot of discussion about precisely where these greenfield sites should be. Here you have a critical balance to strike. The whole basis of the Shadow Factory scheme, why it comes to Coventry, is that you have, in a sense, a concentration of entrepreneurial talent, organisational skills, engineering skills, management skills, within a fairly narrow geographical area.
Well, the enthusiasm of roots in Coventry obviously helped a great deal, but the Midlands was very much the centre, with, if you include Oxford, of the automotive industry at that period. It was also the centre of the growth of light engineering between the two world wars, and it was where the skills resided that were necessary to the expansion of aircraft production. You know, the aircraft industry itself was very scattered about the country, and some companies like Gloucester Aircraft stayed in business by manufacturing milk churns on the side and all sorts of other activities, whereas within the West Midlands you had a very solid concentration of state-of-the-art companies within their sector, and that was very attractive.
The key thing was to, of course, to enlist the interest and the support of the motor manufacturers themselves. Not only the motor manufacturers, but the key aircraft manufacturer. The aircraft in particular that Britain decided to in a sense, to support was the Blenheim. This was, as we now know, not a particularly effective aircraft, but it was the best that Britain had in the circumstances in the mid-1930s. And the Blenheim was being constructed by the Bristol Aircraft Company, and therefore how the scheme would inevitably have to operate was you would have to transfer the technology from the Bristol company, the aircraft company, to the motor manufacturers. So the first thing, of course, was to enlist the support and interest and the backing of these motor manufacturers. As far as Coventry was concerned, the key one really was Roots, but also Rover was a significant one. Further afield, we know, of course, Austin was going to be important, but essentially the concentration was in the West Midlands.
Well, in the late 30s, when it was becoming clear that there was a war coming, the car industry, of course, continued to build vehicles, which is obviously the natural product. So a lot of the pre-war products were adjusted to wartime production. A lot of the vehicles were turned to military vehicles. This could sometimes mean just regular cars being painted green and used as saloon cars, but also more specifically some of the commercial vehicles were used as military vehicles, lorries, etc. But also very specific military products like armed cars were built, or more fighting vehicles were built by the car industry. But sometimes
was at peril, in a sense, from the threat from Germany. And particularly from German air power. As we know, the Nazis made great propaganda claims about the power of their air force, the Luftwaffe. Subsequently, we understand those claims were inflated, but nevertheless it caused grave concern in British political and military circles. And of all the potential threats that Britain faced in the 1930s, and remember, Britain had an empire, So there was a threat in the Far East from Japan, a threat in the Mediterranean from Mussolini, endangering British Mediterranean interests. Now those things would have required building of ships first and foremost, but the biggest threat, the biggest danger was perceived to be from German air power. And so the clear need was to build up a British Air Force, and in particular a strategic decision was taken in 1936 that there had to be in a sense a deterrent, and that deterrent meant building British bomber aircraft. The hope was, of course, that if Britain built sufficient air power in this particular area, that would deter Germany from launching any attacks against Britain. So the clear strategic need was to build bomber aircraft, but Britain did not have basically the engineering capacity to be able to switch on the building of large numbers of bomber aircraft. And so the idea was to harness existing engineering capacity, and that meant for Britain that meant the car industry, and particularly the car industry in the West Midlands, and within that Coventry was the centre.
The government had decided quite early as 1927, that should there be another war, then the existing aircraft industry would have to be supplemented. And while the interwar period kept a design and technology base going, it was on very small batch orders over a variety of types. So as things developed in other areas of industry, particularly the automotive industry, the government started to formulate the idea that maybe the productive capacity of the automotive industry could be harnessed to the technology from the aircraft industry. And one of the drivers for that was the idea that both aircraft and cars were moving towards metal fabrication. And while that was the initial spark for the idea, in fact it was a little bit of a misunderstanding, because aircraft tolerances were far tighter than automobile tolerances. So the initial factories were set up with the assistance of the existing motor industry, and Coventry was involved because of the enthusiasm for Roots in particular to be involved in this. Other manufacturers in the automotive sector were more sceptical. The aircraft manufacturers themselves were again rather concerned about the dilution or the entry of other firms into their arena. But the first set of factories established particularly around Coventry to make the Bristol engine were actually demonstrated to be very successful, and that led to further thinking of a second phase, and subsequently other firms that were initially sceptical became involved in production as the war progressed.
It's sometimes very difficult to find out who precisely built what, because a lot of the production was dispersed again, or some of the suppliers, and even internally within Coventry, for example, the Standard Motor Company built mosquitoes, but some of those components they built over 1,000 mosquitoes in Coventry, but some of the parts they were built at the Canley site in their factory here in Coventry, but they were assembled on the outskirts at Anstey in Coventry, which is a factory that's still standing, currently being operated by Rolls-Royce, and that's where the plane flew off. Obviously the Rolls-Royce engines were supplied by Rolls-Royce, but some of the components of that mosquito would no doubt have been built by other companies here in Coventry, or even their suppliers that they traditionally used before the war, because a lot of the production process was broken up and different people. The shadow scheme was introduced by the government in the late 30s to duplicate or to increase production in preparation for the war effort. It could mean two things really. It could mean that existing companies were given the resources to build additional capacity either on site or on a different location in the country to produce, to shadow their product to increase production. But it could also mean that a product was given to a completely different company so that a separate company with the necessary experience and skills could build somebody else's product to duplicate production for both reasons, again for increased output, but also should one of the production lines be hit, that there was a separate production line in place with the skills and the experience to build products.
There was a growing concern in the mid-1930s that Britain